The next episode of Transformers Prime, Out of His Mind, picks up pretty much exactly where the previous episode left off, skipping just enough time for Ratchet to have administered the cure to Optimus and fixed his cybonic plague. But immediately we are reminded of the cliffhanger that the previous episode left off on, which will of course be the main focus of this episode. Which is not to say that this episode doesn't give us anything else. This is still a primarily episodic show, after all. It just has serialized elements. So this episode does have an ancillary plot, which is more episodic. Fowler contacts the Autobots and reveals that Starscream has stolen some piece of human technology. They are able to deduce that he plans to use it as a component in a super laser that he can use to melt the Arctic, allowing him to get to an otherwise unminable patch of energon, but it'll also melt one of the polar ice caps and kill a lot of people, so they have to stop it. We also see confirmation early on that his plan with Knockout to usurp control from Megatron by eventually killing him off, and then make Knockout his second in command, allowing his power to trickle down to him, is still in effect. They just weren't able to enact it yet. This scene in particular was a real highlight of the episode, as we got a fantastic monologue from Starscream, he's just a great, classic, nefarious villain. He's a magnificent bastard, and I love every second that he's on screen. Even when he's being like a complete dick and torturing people, he's still charismatic as a villain. Like, you hate what he's doing, you want to see him get what's coming to him for it, and this episode does scratch that itch quite well. But he's still fun to watch. He's like the Joker in that regard, or Loki maybe. And this version of Starscream is one of the best that's ever been in one of these Transformers shows. It's never really made clear why Starscream doesn't just unplug Megatron right here. There must have been something going on in the background that prevented him from making his move right now. Maybe Soundwave was still monitoring Megatron himself or something. After all, RC did almost manage to kill Megatron in the previous episode. She managed to unplug him from life support before she and Bumblebee retreated. They just happened to plug him back in a second later. And all of this does culminate in a fantastic action sequence where we get to see Breakdown do something again, which is always nice. We even get to see him go toe-to-toe with Bulkhead and get a clear idea of just how powerful these two characters are. The visuals here were great. The choreography in the fight was above average at the very least. It was all exciting. This entire plot was exciting, but it managed to be exciting while being window dressing for the main story of this episode. Megatron recognizes that he needs to get back to his body, and the only way to do that is to take control of Bumblebee, and so throughout this episode he does that, slowly, seizing more and more control. And because it's hard to have an episode focusing on a character who, one, doesn't talk, and two, is possessed by another character, this means that the episode ends up focusing on Raph, which is good because honestly we don't know that much about him yet. He notices pretty much right away that something seems to be off about Bumblebee, but to the credit of the other characters, they do too. It's just that Ratchet at first misdiagnoses what's wrong with him, thinking that his psyche was in some way affected by the connection with Megatron and that he just needs time to recover. They essentially perform a factory reset, turning him off and letting him sit for a while his mind resets itself and calms down. And the entire time that they do, despite the fact that this isn't like sleeping or like being in a coma, he's turned off. Raph stays with him and talks to him because he promised him that he'd be there. Considering that the conversations that these characters have from the perspective of the audience are always one-sided, these are the two characters in the show that we probably know the least about at this point. We know that Bumblebee's a badass and that he's brave, but we don't know much about the personal side of him, and through Raph in this episode, we get to know that about him. Once the rest of the team is gone off to thwart Starscream's plans, Ratchet questions Raph as to why he's still there, and Raph points out that he and Bumblebee see each other as family. Something that Ratchet just doesn't understand since they're not even the same species, but Raph makes it very clear why he feels this way. It's a bit cheesy, but I still really like it. His family is very large, his actual family, and he tends to get drowned out in the sea of voices. But Bumblebee listens to him, and somehow, some way, he's able to listen back. Thankfully, they never go like the Chosen One route or anything and turn Raph into something more than just a kid who happens to be a really good person and also happened to be able to overcome the language barrier between him and this person who he forged a very strong bond with. Because that would just straight up the cheese to Cheese Whiz levels, which, as I'm sure you know, is a critical mass of cheesiness. The show would have just imploded in on itself at that point. But even though Raph and Bumblebee are reading their own meaning into this detail that Raph can somehow understand him, that doesn't mean it doesn't have meaning to them. And that's what's important. Of course, turning Bumblebee's brain off was a big mistake, though, as it allows Megatron to seize complete control of him. Megatron has to make himself remember, but he does recall that Starscream pulled the Dark Energon from his chest after he was injured in the space bridge explosion. The implication here is that if the Dark Energon had remained within him, he would have healed on his own, rather than having to be kept alive by life support. And earlier in the episode, during Starscream's monologue, he pointed out that he has that shard of Dark Energon still. Megatron can't get to it, and that it's the last shard that Megatron collected. There isn't any. Except Megatron remembers that he did throw a shard into the Earth to resurrect all of those Terracons that fought against Ratchet and Optimus. He bridges to that site in Bumblebee's body, and this is how Ratchet and Raph deduce that it's Megatron who's in the driver's seat, since only he, Optimus, or Megatron would have known the coordinates for that site. Once he's there, he collects that shard of Dark Energon, and he makes his way back to the Nemesis, once again using the ground bridge at the Autobot base, so they're able to follow him by his coordinates. Raph insists that he goes along, claiming that Bumblebee needs him, and Ratchet lets him, and you can tell that he doesn't really believe that this human can do anything to help Bumblebee, which makes it interesting that he agreed to let Raph come at all, but I think I know why he did it. Ratchet in this show may come off as a hard-ass, but I think Raph actually got through to him. Raph actually got him to realize that you can forge a family with people who you aren't actually related to. After all, isn't that what this team is to each other? A big family that's been forged over time through hardship? I think he sympathized with Raph and realized that even though Bumblebee might not need Raph, Raph might still need to be there for himself. I mean, granted, also we have seen Bumblebee manage to fight back against Megatron's control a couple times now to keep from killing Raph, so maybe that was a factor in Ratchet's thinking, and it was still probably stupid to take Raph along, but it shows that Ratchet is softening as a character. He's coming to be endeared by these humans, even though he still doesn't really like them that much. And while the action climax of this episode is happening, there is a secondary climax happening on the Nemesis. Megatron, still in Bumblebee's body, straight up decks Ratchet and ignores Raph completely, because why wouldn't he? As he plans to inject the Dark Energon into the chest of his true body and then use a cortical psychic patch to return himself to his own mind. And Raph, despite the fact that he would do anything to get Megatron out of Bumblebee's body, tries to stop him because he recognizes how dangerous this would be, how much of a bad idea this is. And even though he can't do anything about it, that cements him as a true hero. The fact that he was willing to do that, it cements him as a true hero. And honestly, I believe that Bumblebee would have wanted him to try to stop this if he could. I honestly believe that Bumblebee would choose to be a receptacle for Megatron's mind permanently if it meant that Megatron couldn't return to his own incredibly destructive body. If it meant that Megatron couldn't return to commanding the Decepticons. I believe that Bumblebee would have even offed himself if it meant killing Megatron. And I believe those things because throughout this episode, we have seen Bumblebee's characterization reflected onto Raph. If they really are so meaningful to each other, then they must be similar people, and if Raph is willing to make that sacrifice for Bumblebee, then I believe that Bumblebee would make that sacrifice for himself. And this is all super meaningful considering where Bumblebee's arc goes in the future. But Raph, of course, fails because he's a tiny, squishy person and not a giant robot. And Megatron is completely healed by the Dark Energon and immediately returns to his position as leader of the Decepticons. But once he does, even though these three Autobots, or rather these two Autobots and their one human ally, stood against him and delayed his plans, he ignores them. He's Megatron. They are so far beneath him that he equates killing them to an extermination. Now, maybe he would have killed them himself, but in his own words,
I have my own extermination to perform.
Because this isn't your dad's Megatron, kids. This isn't G1 Megatron who let the backstabbing Starscream stick around after he betrayed him. This Megatron is gonna do something about that shit. He is in fact so pissed off that he ignores not just the Autobots in the room with him, giving them a chance to escape. Not only does he ignore RC and Bulkhead fighting out on the ice, but he ignores Optimus Prime, his sworn enemy, who also incidentally gets some really badass scenes in this episode, and goes straight for Starscream. And we don't get to see what he does, but Starscream's screams are evidence that it's pretty freaking bad, and this is brilliant. Because even though I said earlier that Starscream is a magnificent bastard and an enjoyable villain to watch, he's the kind of villain you love to hate. And having Megatron do whatever he's going to do to him off-screen not only keeps the show PG, but also allows our imaginations to take over. And in my imagination, everything that I've ever wanted to see happen to Starscream can happen to Starscream. It's a win-win. The episode ends on a touching scene between Bumblebee and Raph. Overall, it's fantastic. This entire episode is great. Aside from differing tangential plots, this feels like one episode along with the previous episode. Like, obviously, they're not the same episode. They still have their own episodic stories with the virus plot in the previous episode and the super laser plot in this one. But they flow so well into each other, and this episode so expertly takes the B plot of that previous episode and turns it into the A plot. It's seamless. It's very well written. It's one of the best episodes of the entire show. These two episodes together are two of the best episodes of the entire show already in the first season. Which, now that I think about it, may say something about later seasons. Later seasons are still good, I promise. Point is, I love these episodes. I don't even know if I need to say anything else. The relationship between Bumblebee and Raph that was fleshed out here carried the episode. It was great, and you guys should watch it unfold. Just go watch the episode.